She crumpled in the salt-white glare, her brush-tail falling slack around my forearm like a ribbon losing its knot. So I gathered her up and forced my boots to keep moving across the broken sand, because stopping meant the desert would write both our names into its quiet forever, and I had already decided it would not have hers, not today. Lyra's breath ghosted against my collar as the horizon boiled with a wall of wind, a tan-black leviathan swallowing sky, and all the stories my regiment told about these wastes felt small compared to the roar rolling toward us. So I scanned the scab dunes for anything like shelter, anything like mercy, until a rip in the ridge appeared, an old wind-dug hollow where we could tuck our bodies and our stupid hope, and I slid us inside just as the sandstorm struck, the world outside turning to teeth while I wrapped my field coat around us both and told myself that endurance is just love, held long enough to become a weapon. The cave was no sanctuary carved by kindly hands, only a lung of stone that had learned to breathe sand. But it held, and the storm's scream became a private curtain across the mouth, so our voices felt like secrets the desert could hear but not steal, and I set the glow lamp on a ledge to make a trembling circle where Lyra's vulpine ears cut clean silhouettes against the wall. She muttered in Vesperine, sharp little syllables like flint, scolding the weather as if it were a misbehaving cub, and her tail wound my waist in a firm ring that said we were one unit now whether I'd earned that honor or not, while grit rattled the rock like dry rain, and I tried to breathe through a throat lined with powder, telling her we'd wait it out, because storms pass even when they pretend they never will, and she huffed the kind of laugh that tastes like disbelief and trust in the same breath. Storms here can last days, soldier, she said, eyes bright in the lamp's stutter, the golden kind that looks like a hearth when the rest of the room is cold. And she added that Vesperine don't settle in deserts because they're clever, which made me answer that humans don't either. We just confuse stubbornness with wisdom and call it courage. And that earned me a proper bark of laughter before it softened into something she only ever showed me. I lowered my pack, my back singing a protest, and she leaned into the angle of my shoulder like a promise that wouldn't say itself out loud, telling me I was stubborn, not stupid, which I accepted because coming this far with her already proved the distinction. And as the wind pawed at the stone, I wrapped the coat higher, breathed her scent of resin and dust, and the sharper note of metal polish she used on her knives, thinking how strange that the sound of a world being sanded flat could make the dark feel almost tender. We shared the last full ration that first night, the biscuit tasting like old cardboard and grit, but breaking in half anyway. And Lyra made a game of it, because survival is theater when you're trying to convince someone to smile, snapping the edge away from my fingers with a little flash of teeth and crowning herself hungriest huntress, while crumbs framed her lips like a constellation. I grumbled that she'd regret it when her legs failed first, and she rolled her eyes and called me dramatic. Yet when I slid the bigger piece her way, I pretended not to notice my own hand doing it. And she absolutely noticed because that is how her people live, observant as predators and as caretakers both. So her tail brushed my knuckles, then tightened at my waist like she was lashing the two of us to the same mast, and she asked if I was the kind who would give everything away, and I said not everything, just what matters, which is how I tell the truth when I'm afraid the whole thing will burn me if I hold it too near. By the second day, the cave air thickened with floating grit, and the lamp burned a tired yellow that made time look sticky. So Lyra turned to grooming not like vanity, but like ritual, pulling dust from her red-gold tail with long strokes that calmed her breathing. And when I teased her, she said each pass was memory work, that the resin on her brush smelled like home forests which glowed blue after dark under bioluminescent vines, and that the market streets were strung with lanterns shaped like moons that sang when the wind touched them. I asked if she missed it, and her hand slowed as if the word itself weighed more than they could lift. Then she nodded, not proudly, not apologetically, just honestly. And I told her if the forest lived in her fur it was not lost, which she accused me of saying because I'm good at small noble lies. And I answered maybe I believe them because the alternative is a colder religion. And she smirked a little and warned me that if I kept sounding like a poet she'd assume I liked her. And I let my mouth betray me into a smile I couldn't stop. Night made the cave a throat where the storm's howl carried like a low organ note. And we pressed under the blanket because heat is a currency you spend together or not at all. Her tail snug around my waist, her breathing a steady metronome that told my own lungs what to do. until her voice slid out quieter than I'd ever heard it and told me I should hate her. I asked why, and she said she'd dragged me off my duty path, that I could have kept my regimented life and my rank and my predictable death, and that now I was branded deserter because of a fox with too many secrets. And she loosened her tail as if afraid of claiming what she feared to own. I took her hand, brushed the dust from the curve of her claws, and told her that choice was mine, that no one steals a decision from me and lives. And if ruin was the cost, I'd pay it on my own terms. And her throat worked around something unshed as her tail tightened again, firmer, warmer, the ring of a vow that didn't need a priest. "You're bonded to me," she said, the word proud and embarrassed at once, like she'd set a trap and stepped into it willingly. And when I asked what that meant in Vesperine eyes, she inhaled like a diver and told me it meant forever, not a night or a season or until the harvests fail. And the cave held still in a way caves don't, as if to mark the sentence with a notch in stone. I let the quiet breathe while I measured what truth feels like when it finally stops running, then told her that sounded right because I wasn't planning to go anywhere unless she pushed me. And she blinked like I'd knocked sand out of her lashes, and then smiled a slow, warm curve that had no mischief left in it, whispering stubborn fool at me, as if it were a title, and I answered yours because some words are swords when you need them and pillows when you don't. And her head tucked under my chin with a surety that made the storm's rage feel like a loud neighbor instead of an ending. By the next turn of sleeping and waking, the roar hadn't eased so much as grown familiar, a monster learning to hum. And our water had become a line in a ledger where every swallow demanded confession. But routine is a kind of salvation. So she groomed, and I cleaned the rifle I swore we'd never use again, both of us tending to tools that had carried us through worse than weather. We talked in the slow way people do when there's no clock on the wall, traded slices of histories as if they were dried fruit, and I told her about the colony where I grew, the wheat fields rippling like a hand smoothing a blanket, the festival fires that smelled like sugar and oil and joy, and she listened with her ears canted just so, not teasing for once, then answered with the Vesperine's lantern dances and their aurora hunts, with elders painting stories across bark in light dye that sang. When it dried, and we found ourselves laughing at how both our people throw parties for survival, how we make meaning out of hauling food and outlasting storms, and for a little, while the grit in our teeth tasted like salt from good bread, instead of the world trying to file us down. On the third sleep, exhaustion made the cave feel smaller, like the walls had learned a new trick of leaning in, and our supplies announced their ending with the rude transparency that hunger gives numbers. So we held the last strip of ration between us, and didn't bother pretending we didn't know what it meant, and Lyra tapped it against my chest. Mock offering, real decision, before taking it for herself because I told her to, because she would have fought me if I'd tried to be heroic, and sometimes love is letting the other person be strong without making a speech about it. She said the desert wasn't done with us, and I agreed like a man signing a contract he didn't read, because what mattered was the clause about us, about walking when it cleared until we found a place worth the cost of breath, and the thought of a settlement shifted inside us like a small live thing we could protect. So we lay down not to sleep exactly, but to practice being still, her tail returning to my waist, like a home address, and the storm outside changed key just enough to warn us that it was thinking about releasing us back to a sun that would try new methods. When daylight bled thin through the cave mouth the next time, the wind had dropped from scream to snarl, and by the lamp's gutter we knew the hour had come to step out and give the desert our faces again. So we packed what was left, the ritual taking on the dignity of a funeral for easy days, and Lyra stretched with an exaggerated groan at the threshold, as if to mock the storm for ending without permission, outside. The dunes had moved while we weren't watching, whole hills shifting like sleeping beasts that had rolled in their rest, and ridges cut the flats with new scars that had not been there when we ran for cover. And the sky did that cruel trick of pretending blue is kind when the ground says otherwise. So I slung the pack, and she grinned, not lightly, but with that tempered bravado that says we're alive and we dare the world to notice. And she warned me that if I'd complained any longer in the cave, she would have left me to my snores, and I told her she wouldn't last an hour without my boring stories to anchor her pulse. And she declared that I'd beg for her tail when the night came cold, which, inconveniently, was true. We moved together across the resculpted sand, side by side because hierarchy is useful in battle, but love insists on parallel lines, the heat building like a secret being told to every grain at once. And after a while Lyra began to hum. Not the rowdy tune she used in the barracks to drive me and 3 bunkmates insane, but the steadier hunting song that keeps footfalls aligned on long stalks. And I asked about it, because talking takes less water than silence when your head is full of ghosts. She told me it was called the Sapphire Woods March, that her father sang it under breath when they tracked Starlight Elk. And I said maybe I should teach her one of ours, and she accused me of threatening to sing, which I denied on principle because I respect her ears. So instead I gave her a story about my home's river, the way it braided the fields like silver thread through a green cloak, and the way festival lanterns looked reflected in that dark water. And her smile went soft in a way the sun couldn't burn away, telling me that my words made the dust sound like rain, which felt like a blessing in a place where blessings cost sweat. When we stopped under a broken ridge for the thin hour of shade the desert allowed, I handed her the canteen, and she took one swallow before trying to give it back, the arithmetic of sacrifice etched in the lines at the corners of her eyes. And I told her we lived or failed together, that any plan that required me to arrive without her wasn't a plan I knew how to follow. And she made some joke about humans being surprisingly good at sharing for a species that fences everything. But her fingers shook when she capped the water, and I pretended not to see because dignity is as important as hydration when you're trying not to break. We walked again, the horizon doing its mirage tricks with phantom rivers and reversing hills, and our talk turned to the future because the present was a knife. So she spun half-serious schemes about stealing a freighter and vanishing into the trade routes, appointing herself quartermaster and captain both, then contradicted herself to dream of a mountain cabin with traps and kitchen gardens and me cursing at a stove while she pretended to be a civilized fox. And when she asked which life I'd choose, I told her neither mattered without her, which tripped her steps for a heartbeat before that wicked smile returned to cover something warmer underneath. The sun slid toward its red hour, and we set our packs near a ridge whose shadow finally meant comfort. And she sprawled on the sand with her tail curled like a flame around her knees and declared that the desert can't break us. Not yet. And I lay beside her to watch the sky turn to iron, and then wine, and then the bruised purple of a night that comes fast in places without trees. And for a little while the war was a rumor we refused to repeat. The bond we'd named in the cave felt like a band of braided leather around our wrists, not choking, not even tight, just present in the way a compass is present. So when her tail drifted to brush my fingers, I didn't say anything clever, only breathe and let the small contact be the sentence that mattered. And she called me a stubborn fool again with no heat in it. And I answered yours because some refrains you keep until they become the true map. And we stared up until the stars came on, bright and indifferent, while our small, defiant warmth insisted on its own gravity in a universe that counts by lifetimes and dunes instead of names. The sun rose like a furnace lid flipping open, and the dunes answered with a glare that felt personal. And though Lyra kept the hunting cadence on her tongue, the notes frayed at the edges the way cloth gives when you pull it once too often. So I matched my stride to hers and cut the pace without naming it, counting breaths and footfalls as if arithmetic could outvote thirst. And when we paused beneath a ragged shelf of rock, I pressed the canteen into her palm and told her to drink more than pride would allow, which earned me a look equal parts mockery and gratitude before she tipped one swallow past her lips and tried to hand it back, as if survival were a test with trick questions. And I said again, we do this together, because I would not imagine any ending that put me on one side of a dune and her on the other. And she sighed in that half-purr way that meant I had won the argument for now, without winning the war we were actually fighting. By mid-afternoon, the heat turned the air to a lens that bent distance, and Lyra shifted from chatter to quick stabs of memory, as if stabbing at silence kept it from growing teeth, telling me about a cousin who cracked a pearl of skyfish in the market and showered the square with bioluminescent chaos until the guards laughed themselves into restraints. And I humored the story because the alternative was hearing our breaths scrape. But even in the joke, I tracked the shortening reach of her stride and the slow drag of her foxtail where it once sketched bright. And when she stumbled on glass sand, her recovery was graceful and costly in the same heartbeat. So I marked the cost in the set of her jaw and the brightness of her eyes. And at the next lee we split the ration strip, and this time she took the smaller portion without making theater of it, because theater is a luxury you spend when your mouth isn't full of heat. The crumbs sticking to her lips like glitter from an old festival as I pretended not to ache at the arithmetic of it. The fourth morning rose pale and deceitful, cool in the shadow and merciless an arm's length beyond, and I set a pace the bodies of plowfolk know, steady, dull, endless. Because endurance is the only music that matters when the song of the day wants to burn you flat. And Lyra kept with me for an hour, maybe two, the space between our footfalls widening and closing like a wary animal. And I made dumb reasons to pause so she could draw alongside without losing ground, tugging a strap that didn't need it or squinting at a horizon that offered nothing but more horizon. And I told her a story about rain on tin roofs at harvest to keep the dust in our mouths pretending to be weather. And she told me about lanterns strung along blackwater paths and dancers painting light on bark in spirals that hummed, though the sentences came like messages from a far post. Late, clipped, sometimes forgetting where they meant to go. So I turned to questions with answers she could give in a breath, the names of star constellations in her tongue, or which knife sat most honest in her palm, keeping her here with me. By noon we crossed a basin where the dunes had been scraped thin, the ground crazed like old pottery, and heat ghosted up in wavering curtains while her tail traced a line that wobbled the way a compass does when the magnet under the table moves. So I pressed the canteen into her hand again and told her more, and she shook her head like refusal were a prayer, saying I would need it when my legs seized and my lungs bit back. And I said I need you, which isn't the same as water, but it is the same as truth. And she finally obeyed like obedience had bones that hurt, staring at a point beyond me, as if drinking were a confession, then wiping her mouth with the back of her wrist, as if erasing a signature. And we started again, and I asked about the color of the summer market lanterns to gather her mind where her feet had to go. And she said green and the blue that isn't sky, the kind that hums because Di remembers it was once a living thing, and I nodded and filed that in the ledger, where I keep reasons to continue when reasons get thin. Evening stretched and the wind took on that familiar knife of grit around our ankles, a meanness you don't notice when strength is full but feel like nettles when it's gone. And I promised a rest at the next ridge, because promises build small bridges across bad minutes. And she said we should keep going in that bright false tone people use when the body has already written a different decision, and we argued for the theater of it, because the real argument was with the sun and loss and the long arithmetic of deserts. And we ate in the lead just enough to remind our stomachs what food sounds like. And when I slid the larger piece toward her, she pushed it back with hands that trembled as if the world had shaken the tendons loose. And we looked at each other with the honesty exhaustion buys cheap. And then she took the smaller anyway, because her stubbornness is a banner and a shield. And we walked, and the light bled from bronze to wine to iron. And she asked me to name our ship when we steal one. So I called it yours because naming is another kind of vow, and she smiled like the word fit a place she'd saved. Night came hard and clean, the stars bright as knives washed and set out to dry, and the dunes went silver with logic the day denied. So I kept a count in my head, 40 steps, breathe, 40 more, because numbers don't lie unless you ask them to. And when the count unraveled, I recited the harvest months, then the names of her cousins, then my mother's recipes for festival stews, anything that built a ladder of words we could climb. And I heard nothing from Lyra for too long and risked a look back to find she'd folded into the sand like a tent collapsing, face half buried, braid unspooling, chest rising shallow, tail limp as a line with no weight, and my heart stuttered the way a gear does when a tooth breaks. So I went to my knees and brushed the sand from her mouth and checked the heat at her temple and the pulse at her wrist, and said unlovely prayers to gods I don't believe in, because belief and bargaining become synonyms when love is on the ground. And I uncapped the canteen with hands that shook and almost poured before remembering her words about leaving me enough to live. And I said aloud that she doesn't get to decide the terms alone, then took the drink like a promise and touched the canteen to her arm like a seal, so the vow belonged to both of us. Lifting her was less like picking up weight and more like taking responsibility you cannot set down, the kind of burden that empties the carrier to fill the carried. And the sand made a sport of it by sucking at my boot heels and tilting under me like a board loosened from its nails. So I anchored her head in the crook of my elbow and set my spine into a straight truth, moving in the way harvest teaches you, rhythm over heroics. patience over speed, and I talked to her because sound keeps the night from mistaking you for stone, telling her about the barn cat that brought gifts of mice to boots, and the way rain on tin lulls you faster than any lullaby. And I checked her breath against my wrist, steady enough, a small drum that refused to miss its beat. And when my back lit with a rod of pain, I accepted it as the price written in the margins, and I counted again, and the dunes became a single long dune that kept curving, and the sky paled at the edges in that way that means dawn or delirium or both. And I leaned my cheek to her temple for 2 steps, and then forced my head up again, because sentiment can trip a man as easily as a stone. Her eyes cracked open like shells, unsure if the tide had truly retreated, a sliver of gold seeking a shape to name. And when they found me, instead of the sky, a sound came out of me I didn't recognize, something half laugh and half sob. And I told her we were almost there, though there was just another dune ahead and another after that. And she shaped my name without sound, and then breathed, stubborn fool, in a voice so thin it felt like a thread I had to hold with both hands. And I answered, yours. Because repetition is a spell. And her tail managed a weak curl around my forearm before it fell again. And that small pressure laid a rail of iron through my spine that every step could run on. And I told her about painting the ship named Crooked on a hull too big for our courage, and how she'd win the argument about color like she always did. And she made the smallest disapproving face at Crooked, which gave me air enough for another rise and another descent and another foolish promise about blankets and beds, and her stealing the warm side and calling it logistics rather than affection. When shapes resolved on a far ridge, too regular for dunes, too wary for mirages, the part of me that guards against hope told me to keep my eyes low, but the part that had carried her this far lifted anyway. And I raised my free hand in a motion that shook so much it looked like a flag in a light wind, and the figures fanned as trained people do, rifles slung, goggles bright with reflected dawn, and voices came like leaves across stone. Words I couldn't parse, but tone I could, and I took 3 more steps, because 3 more is a number I could bully my body into. And then my knees found the ground, not as surrender, but as a negotiation I lost. And I lowered Lyra so her head didn't strike, and kept my arms around her, because letting go felt like breaking the only rule that mattered. And I said, help her, in a voice that tasted of iron filings. And then the world gently slid sideways. The brightness narrowed to a coin. And before darkness took me, I felt her tail brush my wrist again, like punctuation that wasn't a period, just a comma where a breath belongs. The in-between was all cloth and smoke and the slow lap of voices against the shore of my hearing. And sometimes Lyra's touch crossed the water and found my hand, a warm map telling me where I'd left my body. And sometimes I drifted on her humming. The Sapphire Woods March turned to a thread a child might follow. While other times I rose enough to feel a cool flow in my veins like melted glass, and remember that someone had hung a bag above me and decided I was worth the trouble of tethering. And each time I sank again, I carried a little more certainty that we had not died in the teeth of the wastes, but were instead paying the toll of returning. And when waking finally came like a curtain pulled in a tent, I opened my eyes on amber light through stitched canvas, poles angled like ribs around me, and pain lit my body in neat lanterns at shoulder and back and thigh, as if to mark what I had spent. Lyra sat at my side in a posture that said every muscle had decided to remain on duty, ears pricked to every rustle of canvas and clink of bowl, tail coiled firmly around her knees like a belt keeping her together. And when I croaked her name, she moved without her usual theater, kneeling close with hands careful on my shoulder and a smile that trembled at the edges but refused to fall. And she called me a stubborn human in a whisper that had too much relief to succeed at scolding, and I told her I'd warned her I intended to see both of us through, which earned me the faintest huff of a laugh and a tail that slid to claim my wrist where a needle sat, as if she needed to mark me again after letting the desert try to erase our lines. And I turned my hand so my fingers found fur, and we breathed like a 2-part engine finding its rhythm after someone strikes the casing with a wrench to get it going. She told me where we were. Rail territory, desert-born. Folk whose skin carries the map of stone, eyes bright as mirror sand. Not human and not Vesperine, a settlement that survives because it refuses the romance of charity. And as if to prove her brief, 2 of them entered without fanfare, tall and cut from sandstone with pale irises that made them look like they'd borrowed light. and they regarded us the way storms regard tents, considering how the geometry holds. And the elders said simply, "You lived," while the other noted that I had carried her, and a sound passed between them like a gate unlocking a notch. And they called my effort endurance greater than their own with a tone that wasn't quite praise and wasn't quite warning, and Lyra's smile sharpened with pride at the compliment I would have shrugged off if I'd had swaggered a waist. And then the rail left, the flap shivering behind them as if the desert itself were eavesdropping, and the tent returned to the rhythm of bowls and herb scent and the soft tug of fluid obeying gravity. The price was named without cruelty and without apology. Contribution in return for shelter, guard shifts for water, hunts for grain, repairs for shade. No room here for mouths that don't add muscle to the work because the desert counts every heartbeat and extracts a tithe. And Lyra explained it in the simple grammar of people who have lived where softness kills. Her ears angling low not from fear, but from the weight of arithmetic we already understood, and I cupped her cheek with a thumb that was more bandage than skin and told her we would pay what they asked because I would not put my love back on the sand in the name of pride. And she answered with a quick, fierce kiss that warmed places even the sun couldn't reach. And when she pulled away, her tail wrapped my waist like it had in the cave and in the night sea of dunes. The gesture not a bow or a chain, but a loop you step into willingly and refuse to step out of, because it is who you are when the world is honest. When my strength steadied enough to sit, I drew her onto the cot beside me despite the tangle of lines, because proximity has always been our medicine, and we breathed in the dim amber until the tent walls felt less like a cage and more like a heartbeat. And she said she had heard me while I carried her, every farm story and foolish plan and paint-flake promise, that the words tethered her when the dark bargained hard. And I told her that I would have carried the world too if it meant keeping. The sound of her return, and the wind raked the canvas as if to remind us it would still be there tomorrow and tomorrow. And I turned the rail price over in my head and found something like gratitude hidden under the austerity, because a clear ledger is kinder than mercies that sour. And I said we would earn our water and our shade and our place. And she nodded with that fox smile that means she will hold me to my bravado in the most inconvenient ways possible. And I let myself lean my forehead against hers while the desert scratched its careful song outside. The rail settlement rose from the dunes like an afterthought the desert had changed its mind about erasing. A tangle of stretched canvas, bone-colored stone, and towers of woven reed that shimmered in the heat, so they looked half-imagined until you touched them and felt the stubborn architecture of survival. Their air carried the scent of brine and smoke, salt from underground wells, ash from thornwood fires that never quite went out. I learned quickly that nothing here was wasted. Every drop, every movement, every breath earned its right to stay. Lyra stood beside me at the tent's threshold the morning they released us to walk again, her fur combed into order, but her eyes still rimmed in exhaustion's shadow, and she whispered that among the rail, every gesture meant more than its surface. Bow too low and you offered debt. Stand too straight and you issued a challenge. So we learned to move like reeds, not yielding, not stiff, just precise enough to survive the wind. Work came before welcome. The quartermaster, a woman whose skin patterned like cracked clay and whose voice rasped from breathing sand too long, set our tasks with the blunt certainty of command. Lyra would join the scouts who mapped shifting dunes and hunted the cave hares that tunneled under the settlement's foundations. I would haul water from the deep wells at dawn and take a guard shift when the sun dropped. No uniforms, no ranks, just duty measured in what a body could still do. The desert had stripped away our old lives so thoroughly that obedience felt almost clean. When I shouldered the rope-burning buckets, Lyra's tail brushed my hip in silent promise, a habit she refused to unlearn. And then she was gone into the glare with the other scouts, a flicker of red among beige and bone. I watched until the heat swallowed her shape, then turned toward the wells where the air shimmered with ghosts of steam. The wells themselves were miracles disguised as work. They plunged into the planet's hidden veins, bringing up water that glowed faintly blue with minerals that could chew through skin if left too long in the sun. We used stone filters and cloth strainers, singing rhythm songs in the rail tongue, a guttural cadence that felt more like heartbeat than melody. They taught me the words quickly because songs are lighter than silence, and I found myself humming as I lifted each brimming bucket to the troughs. The rail watched, curious, This pale human who carried more weight than sense. And one of them finally nodded approval, a gesture so small it felt like sunlight on frost. Acceptance here came in fractions. You gathered them like pebbles and built a home out of patience. By evening, when the shadows stretched long and the air cooled enough to breathe without pain, I would find Lyra by the edge of camp. She'd return coated in a thin shimmer of dust, her braid loosened by wind, her tail twitching slow in the rhythm of someone too tired to pretend she wasn't. She'd hand me a strip of roasted hare or a handful of desert fruit, hard little orbs that tasted like smoke and honey, and we'd sit on the ridge watching the sky bruise into indigo. The stars came earlier here, sharper, almost close enough to pluck. The rail didn't name constellations, they called them paths of the lost, believing each light was a soul who'd walked the desert too long and risen rather than vanish. Lyra liked that. She said maybe when we finally burned out, we'd hang there together, two stubborn fools refusing to blink. I told her I'd rather stay on the ground as long as she did. She smiled but didn't answer. Days braided into a pattern of toil and brief reprieve. My shoulders toughened, the burns on my palms turned to callus, and the tremor in Lyra's steps faded until she moved like herself again, fluid, sly, half music. Yet something under her jokes had changed. The desert had taken her mirth and distilled it into resolve. She laughed still, but quieter, and when I caught her staring toward the horizon, I knew she was mapping more than dunes. She was measuring freedom against debt. The rail didn't cage us, but their kindness had a ledger. We owed our lives, and debt in this heat was as heavy as water. When she spoke of it, it was never with bitterness, just that precise tone she used when sharpening a blade. Safety, she told me one night, is just a slower kind of dying if you forget to look past the walls. The walls, if you could call them that, were circles of stacked stone reinforced by ancient ship plating. At sunset, they glowed like rusted gold, and beyond them the dunes shifted in the wind's patience, rearranging history grain by grain. I patrolled along them on my assigned watch, spear in hand instead of rifle, because metal rounds were too precious. The desert's quiet is never silence. It breathes, it whispers, it hides movement in the lull between heartbeats. That's where I first saw the shimmer, something moving far out on the flats, low and deliberate, like heat learning to crawl. The rail captain beside me muttered a curse and reached for the horn slung at her belt. Sand leeches, she spat. I'd heard the stories, but thought them superstition, vast segmented things that tunneled beneath the dunes, drawn to vibration, swallowing entire caravans before vanishing again. The captain's order was simple: hold the line, burn them if they surface, and the torch crews ran to their posts. Flames bloom differently in dry air. They bite quick, starve quicker. When the ground trembled under my boots, I felt the echo through the soles, like something ancient flexing its hunger. The first leech erupted not 50 meters away, sand cascading off its plated hide in an avalanche of grit. The rail met it with coordinated precision, spears tipped with burning resin plunging into its open maw, and the creature convulsed, spraying acidic mist that hissed against metal. I lunged to drive my spear through a softer joint, the motion automatic, muscle memory from battles long lost, and when the beast shuddered apart, the captain gave me a single nod before returning to the others. The whole attack lasted minutes, but when it ended the dunes smelled of scorched salt and victory the color of ash. My arms shook from adrenaline, my mind oddly calm. Fighting made sense. Survival always does when it has a clear enemy. That night, Lyra found me sitting outside the tent, the torchlight cutting shadows across my face. She crouched beside me, her tail brushing my knee, eyes catching every flicker of flame like mirrors. "Heard you made friends with a leech," she said, voice half tease, half worry. I shrugged. It made the mistake of surfacing. She laughed, a low ripple, then grew quiet. "The rail said you fought like one of their own. That's rare praise. And dangerous," I answered, thinking of the captain's assessing gaze. Lyra tilted her head. "You think they'll keep us?" "I think they'll test how far we bend." She considered that, then leaned in until her forehead touched mine. "Then we bend together." The words were simple, but they locked into me like a key. Weeks passed, and the settlement's rhythm became ours. Dawn labor, midday rest, night watch, the endless negotiation between fatigue and purpose. Lyra taught the scouts new ways to read wind patterns. I repaired fences, sharpened weapons, carried loads that needed carrying. The rail trusted deeds, not oaths. Slowly, we stopped being strangers. A child once brought Lyra a carved charm shaped like a foxtail, saying it was for luck. She tied it to her braid and wore it without irony. I learned the word they used for us, those who returned from the void. It sounded almost holy. Sometimes I caught the captain watching us with a look that was not suspicion but expectation, and I wondered what story she thought we were about to fulfill. Then came the day the desert changed its mood again. The horizon darkened not with storm, but with movement, a shifting shadow line that rolled like tide. Scouts reported raiders from the northern ridge, human, desperate, driven by the same famine that built this place. The rail prepared without ceremony, weapons checked, water sealed, orders given in that clipped tongue. I was assigned to the east wall, Lyra to the western flank. We crossed paths at the armory, both reaching for the same handful of bolts. She caught my wrist, her grip quicksilver. "Don't play hero," she said. "Heroes die first. You telling me to run? I'm telling you to live, for once." I smiled despite the dry fear in my gut. "Then promise you'll do the same." Her ears flattened, the Vesperine sign of reluctant agreement. "Always," she said, and for a moment the world shrank to that word. The raiders struck at dusk, when the sun hung low enough to blind, and the air was heavy with static. Their machines were half alive, scavenged drones fused with flesh and rust, shrieking across the dunes in a storm of dust. The rail fought like the earth itself, silent, coordinated, each movement rehearsed by centuries of survival. I held the line until the air sang with heat and metal, until the world narrowed to targets and recoil, until my hands remembered every battle I'd tried to forget. Through the smoke, I caught a flash of red on the western wall. Lyra vaulting the parapet, blades drawn, her tail cutting arcs through the dust. She moved like a story you tell only once, because retelling would break it. Then the explosion hit, one of the raiders' charges detonating against the outer wall, and the world went white. When sound returned, it came as ringing, the thin cry of wind over ruin. I was on the ground, mouth full of grit, vision splitting between stars and smoke. The wall to the west had folded inward. Fire danced along the edge like a crown. I stumbled to my feet, shouting her name until my throat tore, and pushed through the chaos toward the breach. Rail medics moved past me carrying wounded, but none of them were her. I found her finally near the base of the collapsed tower, pinned beneath a slab of plating, her fur streaked with soot, eyes open but unfocused. "Lyra." I dropped beside her, fingers scrabbling at the metal. She coughed, blood bright against her teeth. "Still stubborn," she rasped. "Should have stayed east. Should have known you'd steal the dangerous post." I levered the plate with a shattered beam until it shifted, freeing her legs. She grimaced but stayed silent. The medics came then, rail hands efficient and unsentimental, lifting her onto a stretcher of woven rope. I followed, numb, through smoke and shouting to the healer's tent. They worked by lamplight, their tools clean and brutal, their language a murmur of measured mercy. When they ordered me out, I stayed anyway, because leaving meant admitting the desert might win after all. Hours blurred. When at last the healer turned to me, his mirror eyes unreadable, he said, "She lives, but her bond is fraying." I didn't understand until I saw the faint shimmer along her tail, a pulse that used to echo my heartbeat, now flickering irregularly. The rail believed in spirit threads, connections forged in life and broken only by distance or death. Ours was weakening. She slept, shallow and restless, and I sat beside her feeling that tether thin, wondering if love forged in survival could withstand another storm. Outside, the desert hissed under a rising wind, and the rail captain's voice carried through the night. Talk of rebuilding, of vengeance, of cost. I listened, but my thoughts were anchored to the woman breathing unevenly on the cot. When her tail twitched weakly toward my hand, I caught it and held fast. "You told me forever," I whispered, "so don't you dare let go now." Her ears flicked at the sound, and though her eyes stayed closed, the bond light steadied once, just once, like a heartbeat learning to remember itself. The dawn after the battle broke pale and wrong, a sky bruised lavender instead of gold, the color of exhaustion more than peace. Smoke still ribboned from the ruins of the west wall, thin and white, curling into the air like the desert exhaling its dead. I sat beside Lyra's cot while the healers sorted the wounded outside, listening to the slow rhythm of her breath and the quiet hiss of sand against canvas. The rail worked without mourning songs. Grief here was private currency, never spent in public. They rebuilt instead, hammers clanging, ropes pulled taut, the creak of stone dragged back into place. Life, in this settlement, began again before the ashes cooled. I envied that discipline. My hands, useless for once, hovered near Lyra's arm where the faint shimmer of our bond glowed like a pulse through her fur. It was weaker than before, fading and returning in small, fragile bursts. Every time it dimmed, I felt it like a rope slipping through my grip. When she woke, it was not with words but a breath sharp enough to cut the silence. Her eyes opened on a flinch, pupils contracting against the light, and I saw the instant she remembered. The battle, the wall, the fall. Pain hit her face, then recognition, then relief that I was still here. She tried to sit, failed, hissed softly. Still alive, she muttered, the voice cracked but trying for humor. I leaned in, brushing dust from her cheek. You were supposed to let me handle the dying hero routine this time. Her mouth twitched. You're terrible at sharing. The line should have been banter, but it trembled halfway through. I took her hand, feeling the pulse stumble beneath her skin. The rail healer had been right. Something in her was unspooling. Your bond, I said quietly. It's fading. Her ears flicked back, a rare sign of fear she couldn't hide. I know. It's not the wound, it's distance. They warned me once. If one of us crosses too far from the other, the thread thins until it forgets what it was tying. Then I won't leave your side. The words came out before I could measure them, solid and instinctive, like stepping into fire to test if it burns. Lyra's eyes closed briefly, lashes trembling. You can't stay chained to me forever. That's the deal we made, I said. You called it forever first. Her laugh came small, almost soundless. Foolish human. You don't even know what it costs. I leaned closer. Then tell me. For a long while she didn't answer. The wind outside pushed at the tent walls, and the light shifted, dimmed, flared again. Finally, she spoke. A bond between Vesperine and human isn't meant to last. It drains us both. Our bodies keep drawing from each other, strength, memory, breath. Eventually one stops giving. I stared at her, heart thudding in disbelief. You mean, one of us will fade first? Usually the human. Her voice broke cleanly, like glass under heat. We weren't built to share souls across species. But the desert didn't ask permission. I sat back, feeling the air turn heavier, the truth settling like dust. And you were going to tell me this when? When it mattered, she said softly. When you were strong enough to choose. Choose what? To stay tethered, or to cut it? To live without me if it means living longer. She met my eyes then, and I saw in her face the same expression she'd worn in the storm when she told me I should hate her. A warning made of love. You could walk out of this camp now, Darius. The bond would unravel before the dunes. You'd live, maybe even find another war to survive. But if you stay, you'll burn with me. For a moment, all the noise outside faded. The hammering, the wind, the voices. Only the sound of her heartbeat, faint but real, filled the space between us. I thought of carrying her through the desert, of the weight in my arms that felt like purpose, not burden. I thought of the storm cave, of her tail tightening around me, of the words forever whispered like a secret spell. You think I'm afraid of burning? I said finally. I've already done it. Every step across those dunes was fire. She stared at me, wide-eyed, disbelief trembling into something softer. Darius. I took her hand, pressing her claws against my chest where my heart hammered too fast. You asked me to choose. I just did. The rail gave us no privacy for long. Work filled the air like a second weather. The captain came to assign me to rebuilding detail, her pale eyes measuring both of us. The wall won't hold another storm, she said simply. We need every hand. I nodded, unwilling to leave Lyra even for an hour. The captain caught my hesitation and studied the faint glow along Lyra's tail. Then the pulse mirrored on my wrist, a bond mark faint as frost. The desert marked you both, she murmured, half to herself. Be careful what you owe it. She left us then, her steps silent against sand.